This is Summit Tunnel. It straddles the boundary between the West Riding of Yorkshire and Greater Manchester in England. It was built in 1840 by the Leeds and Manchester Railway Company. It's an iconic piece of Britain's railway history, but on the 20th of December 1984, it was going to write its own entry into folklore for all the wrong reasons. 6 Mike 08, the 0140 service from Haverton Hill in Teesside to Glazebrook Refinery in Warrington was carrying 13 wagons fully loaded with highly flammable petroleum. The train, hauled by locomotive 47125, had made it as far as Healey Mills at Wakefield, where it was due a crew change. Now, upon its arrival at Healey Mills, it underwent a visual examination by the on-duty rolling stock technician, A.W. Davies. Now, Mr. Davies carried out a visual inspection of both sides of the train, and the fact that it was a visual inspection will become very relevant very shortly. On the train's departure westward, it was staffed by driver S. Marshall and guard F. Broadbent from Newton Heath, and it was also accompanied by Guards Inspector S. Smalley. As is the case with those qualified and experienced in undertaking them, these journeys are usually completely routine, and this was no different. Just a couple of miles before Summit Tunnel, Guard Broadbent and Guards Inspector Smalley had told investigators they'd witnessed the needle for the speedometer falling to 20 miles an hour, which showed that the train had completely and correctly complied with a permanent speed restriction. Once the train had cleared that speed restriction, driver Marshall had accelerated to 40 miles an hour when he closed off the throttle and allowed the gradient to manage the train's onward speed. Now, the train disappeared into the inky blackness of Summit Tunnel, and not long after, it began to shudder violently. Shortly thereafter, driver Marshall reported that the needle on the train brake pressure gauge had fallen to zero, which meant that the emergency brake had applied. Now, the guard Broadbent, thought that this meant the driver had applied the emergency brake. As it turned out, all 3 men on the train jumped out to investigate the problem. Driver Marshall's first response was that he thought, quote, "we were on the floor." Before anyone else could make any kind of response, however, the tunnel was filled with the sound of whooshing and combustion. Back along the train, somewhere between wagons 5 and 6, a fire had spontaneously started, but the fumes had now filled the gaps between each individual piece of ballast on the floor. And to their horror, driver Marshall, Guard Broadbent and Guards Inspector Smalley realised that the floor around them was turning into a carpet of fire. They had no option but to run for their lives. I shan't ask if identifying as a broccoli counts as a STEM subject. On with the story. With a hydrocarbon-fuelled fire chasing them out of the sinister void known as Summit Tunnel, driver S. Marshall, guard F. Broadbent and Guards Inspector S. Smalley faced a mile-long race for survival. Being the youngest of the 3, Guard Broadbent ran on ahead, and about a mile down the line came across signal Papa November 329, which connected him to a signaller based at Preston. Guard Broadbent managed to raise the alarm, pass on the relevant details of the incident, and summon the emergency services. With the geographical location of the tunnel, the response from the fire service was split between 2 brigades, West Yorkshire Fire Service and Greater Manchester Fire Service. Now, it has to be said that the response from both organisations was fantastic. They were on scene within 10 minutes. A cursory inspection of the western end of the train had confirmed that the locomotive and the first 3 wagons hadn't been derailed, so when firefighters returned from inside the tunnel, they asked the train crew if they'd be willing to go back in to pull those first 3 wagons out to safety. All 3 members of the train crew very bravely agreed, but this manoeuvre in itself wasn't straightforward. As is often the case when a train stops suddenly, the couplings in between each wagon are still under a lot of tension, so it's very difficult to get them uncoupled from each other. And this is exactly what had happened with the sudden stopping of the train inside the tunnel. In order to remedy this, Guard Broadbent would have to step in between 2 wagons that were very close to a raging fire. He would have to disconnect the air pipes, close one of the cocks, get driver Marshall to recharge the air in the first 3 wagons. That would then enable those wagons to move. The rest of the train, in theory, should stay still. Further to that, Guard Broadbent would then have to instruct driver Marshall to very carefully move the first 3 wagons back against the burning train in order to loosen the couplers between wagons 3 and 4. This would allow Guard Broadbent to complete the uncoupling process. But you've got to remember that this was being done to a train that was carrying 1.1 million litres of petroleum spirit, and that train was in the middle of a very fierce fire. Both fire brigades, meanwhile, were making good plans to fight the fire. At the western end, Greater Manchester Fire Service's plan involved lowering firefighting equipment down shaft number 8. Now, the tunnel has 12 ventilation shafts, but before they could do that, the fire developed extremely quickly, and this made that plan not viable. In fact, as the fire deteriorated, it quickly became apparent that 170 homes, including those housing disabled people in remote areas, would have to be very quickly evacuated. And one of the overbearing concerns was the effect of leaking petroleum on local wildlife and the environment. Firefighters from West Yorkshire, meanwhile, were using the uphill gradient in the eastern end of Summit Tunnel as a shield from which they could approach the burning train. They were using jets of cooling water to try and reduce the temperature of the flames, and they were also using a foam blanket to try and kill the oxygen supply. This was a ploy that seemed to be working well. They managed to extinguish all the flames around the rearmost 7 wagons of the burning train. That was until the fire developed really rather rapidly, and before firefighters knew what was going on, an explosion occurred around wagon number 6. The firefighters found themselves in a hellish no man's land. The explosion sent huge fireballs careering along the roof of Summit Tunnel. That was until the fireballs encountered shafts 8, 9 and 10 in the roofs, and thankfully this allowed the fire to vent skyward out of those 3 shafts. The Deputy Chief Fire Officer for West Yorkshire and Deputy Chief Fire Officer Howarth had said subsequent to the fire that he believed had the shafts not been where they were, his firefighters would have been burned alive. The beautiful Pennine countryside was disturbed by the sight and sound of a furious column of fire shooting 150 feet into the sky. But what had caused this to happen in the first place? Had it been some kind of terrorist act? Was it a railway accident? Had it been done by the hand of another with some kind of unidentified dark intent? But the fact was, nobody knew at that point. But the truth would very soon become clear. On the county border between Yorkshire and Lancashire in the north of England, spiralling columns of fire were being propelled into the Pennine skyline as a result of an explosion within Summit Tunnel involving a freight train that was carrying 1.1 million litres of highly flammable petroleum spirit. Firefighters from the West Yorkshire Fire Service had been in the tunnel fighting the fire when colossal fireballs started rolling along the roof, turning the tunnel into an oven. Due to the scale and ferocity of the fire, it was obvious firefighters were simply unable to attack it from within the tunnel. As an alternative, Greater Manchester firefighters started pouring high expansion foam down ventilation shaft number 7. Their colleagues from West Yorkshire, meanwhile, continued to attack the fire with jets of high pressured water, but the problem they were facing was the challenge of trying to maintain a workable water supply. You see, at the bottom of the adjacent valley there was a canal, so the supply of water was plentiful, but the challenge lay in trying to get the water up the unforgiving gradients and rugged terrain. The incident commander decided that the best policy was one of containment rather than attack. British Transport Police strictly enforced an exclusion zone around all entrance points, and it was more than 24 hours before it was deemed even remotely safe enough for firefighters to even attempt an exploratory entry. It was just gone 1400 hours the next day when the firefighters who'd gone into the tunnel came out with a progress report for the incident commander. Now, they'd said, unbelievably, that fires were still healthily burning in the tunnel and that the temperature was still at a critical level. Just as daunting as the fire itself, I shouldn't wonder, was the sound of groans and unidentified grinding that filled the tunnel as the firefighters made their way inch by inch towards the site of the fire. Now, these groans and noises were actually put down to the sounds of the metal of the wagons contracting as it cooled. However, in that situation, I think I'd be second guessing my career choices as well. Now, the heat was so intense that a full inspection of the site wasn't possible until the 27th of December, a full week after the incident had taken place. And it wasn't until the 3rd of January 1985 that the fire service was able to hand the site back to British Rail. Now, for those of you who regularly view my videos, you will be aware of how I often speak of Lady Luck and Fortune. Well, it seems that Fortune was on the side of the authorities in this particular incident, because Just 3.5 weeks before this incident took place, West Yorkshire Fire Service and Greater Manchester Fire Service had actually taken part in a drill, reviewing the procedures and reviewing the policies in place to govern the management of any incident involving Summit Tunnel. So these firefighters were very well familiar with the location and with what they were required to do, but I don't think that takes away from the sheer bravery, tenacity and determination that they showed on the day, and the professionalism with which they tackled what must have been a terrifying incident. So once it was deemed safe enough, British rail experts were keen to get into the tunnel and examine what was left of the train to try and glean any clues as to what it was that had caused the incident in the first place. Examinations had shown that a derailment had taken place involving the fourth wagon. The derailment had been caused by a failure of the axle, and this failure specifically involved an issue with the journal bearing at the end of the wheel set that allows the wheel to rotate whilst minimising friction between the wheel and the axle itself. So the likely course of events is that due to an issue with the journal bearing on the end of the axle, the wheel will have stopped turning mid-journey. This means that the energy that would normally have been transferred through the wheel's rotation would have been manifested as a collection of heat, and as the wheel and axle heated up, that will have caused a critical situation to arise where the axle itself will have failed and the wheel will have collapsed, thus derailing the train. Investigators looked at the history of the wagon itself. Now, when they looked at it, it was originally built to carry Class B hazardous substances. Now, Class B hazardous substances are substances that are similar to heavy oil. Here's the thing, converting a vehicle from a Class B vehicle to a Class A vehicle isn't just a process of giving it a lick of paint and changing its stickers. It's much more in depth than that. So in this particular situation, this vehicle would have had a lot of its exterior cladding and insulation removed, because that would give long-term heat protection as opposed to explosive protection. It would have had new valves fitted, it would have had old valves taken out, and it would have had a new pressure release valve system put in to cope with the higher levels of explosive vapour. It would have had man lids installed on the body, and it would have also have had a buffer override protection beam fitted at either end of the vehicle. Now, what these do, in the case of a collision, they will prevent one vehicle riding up over the beam of another vehicle and then potentially piercing that tank. All this work had been done on the vehicles involved in the incident, and this obviously pricks the interest of investigators. But all of it was done compliantly. But what really did pique the interest of the investigators was the fact that on the 4th of December, just a couple of weeks before the incident itself, the wagon concerned had been sent to have new wheels fitted. Now, wheels obviously come in pairs, and they also come with an axle. So they come pretty much as a complete unit. In this particular case, the wheels that had been fitted to this vehicle, this wagon, hadn't been used before. So there were new wheels, there was a new axle, but there were second-hand wheel bearings. The really interesting thing here is that there was no rule against using reconditioned wheel bearings, and analysis of the incidence of failure of wheel bearings had found that these incidents were so low it was difficult, statistically speaking, to even quantify them, to try and come up with a kind of trend or representation of the intervals with which these kind of things happen. So this was something that had simply not really happened before. So from leaving the maintenance facility, the wagon itself had gone to Haverton Hill in Teesside. It had completed a journey to Glazebrook. It had then gone back to Haverton Hill where it had been loaded, and it was then partway through its second journey when the fateful incident took place. Investigators could only make an educated assumption or estimate as to what the precise cause was, largely because of the fact that the fire had been so devastating in its ferocity. Estimates had said that the fire at times had burnt as hot as 8,000 degrees centigrade. However, the overall evidence would suggest that the wheel bearings were simply incorrectly assembled or incorrectly fitted. No individual could be directly linked to the fitting or the assembly because individual components weren't tracked in the same way that complete wheel sets were. The official version of events stated that the incident was caused by the failure of the axle box on the fourth wagon of train 6 Mike 08. This failure of the axle box was a seizure of the journal bearing, which had led to a catastrophic derailment of wagon number 4. Now, wagon number 4's derailment had in turn caused massive and critical damage to the railway track over which the train was travelling, and that damage was responsible for the further derailment of the wagons that were behind it. Bearing in mind, the train was travelling at 40 miles an hour in a tunnel. So where the wagons had derailed, they'd smashed into the tunnel wall. So it was quite conceivable to see that significant damage would have been done to the wagons and to the associated pipework. Things had turned from bad to critical when wagon number 6 had overturned and slammed fully into the tunnel wall. The tank had ruptured, as had its associated pipework, and the escaping fumes and vapour had ignited as a result of the heat generated by the derailment. Now, anyone with any experience of flammable liquids will tell you that they are at their most volatile state when they are in vaporised form, and petroleum spirit is an excellent example of this particular principle. Usually, though, the fires that are generated from these kind of leaks are very violent but very quick. The difference in Summit Tunnel was the fact that leaking product was pooling around the vehicles, and as the air became hotter and hotter in the tunnel, it only became a matter of time before the air reached the temperature at which the pooling petroleum liquid would reach its flat point and ignite. Because of the movement of the air through the tunnel, especially taking into account the ventilation shafts, the tunnel became kind of like an oven. It had massive amounts of captive heat, and it had over 1 million litres of highly flammable fuel sitting there just waiting for its chance to burn. And burn it did. Now, damage to the train was immense. Wheels had been welded, literally welded, to railway lines. Further to that, other wheels had been melted to the shape of teardrops. Entire wheel assemblies and entire wagon frames had been gnarled, twisted and distorted by the sheer heat and fury of the fire that enveloped them. Summit Tunnel itself, meanwhile, stood up spectacularly well to the stresses and strains of what was essentially a crematorium. Certain patches of brickwork had become molten due to the extreme temperatures and had run like liquid glass down the walls. In addition to the vitrification of the bricks, there were also areas of spalling and flaking. But other than that, the structural integrity of the tunnel was never brought into question. Where the ventilation shafts sat at the top of the tunnel, the rings of bricks had become so hot that they had vitrified, and they had reduced themselves to lumps of molten slag which had dropped onto the wagons sat below. Exactly underneath these ventilation shafts were kind of wearing a crown of vitrified brick. The inquiry then turned its attention to how this defect had been allowed to go unnoticed. Well, the first person in the crosshairs of the inquiry was the rolling stock technician at Healy Mills, A.W. Davis. The way in which these particular parts of the wheel sets are configured is that the only way he would have been aware of a problem would have been if he'd have taken the housing off each individual axle. And that just doesn't happen, at least when it comes to carrying out an in-service inspection of a train that's come in partway through its journey. He made a visual inspection of both sides of the train and found nothing wrong. Similarly too, driver marshal and guard Broadbent were free from any blame for the incident. They had merely reacted to the set of circumstances that fate had dealt, and on the whole they'd reacted entirely correctly. The investigation then looked at how the train had managed to pass a number of signal boxes without anything being detected. You see, in the areas where trains are signalled using manual signal boxes with the old semaphore-style signalling, part of the signaller's duty is to watch the train as it goes past and look for any signs of fault, of failure, or any kind of issue. When you look at the design of the wheel bearings itself, any smoke that would have been generated by the problem would have been a result of the heating up of a lubricant or an oil that would have sat inside the housing of the axle. Now, this would have been a very, very small amount of lubricant, and we're talking about hours of darkness here. So the inquiry, quite correctly in my mind, dismissed any thought that any of the signallers along that route had somehow failed in their duties to visually detect any kind of problem. So why wasn't the problem picked up by hot axle box detectors then? The nearest hot axle box detector was 70 miles away at Tollerton, north of York. Now this is because there was a high propensity of manual signal boxes along the route at the time. And the way that hot axle boxes were managed was that they wouldn't tend to be installed on stretches of line that had manual signal boxes, because the signallers themselves would be directly supervising the trains as they passed along the route from signal box to signal box. As a result of the incident, services between Rochdale and Todmorden had been completely cancelled. It took 3 months for British Rail to be able to get to the point where they were removing the last wagon from the train out of the tunnel. Now that shows you the scale of work that was involved in trying to put right what the fire had put wrong. Services resumed on the 19th of August 1985, but brilliantly, before that was allowed to happen, locals who lived in the area were given a once-in-a-generation chance to walk through the tunnel and see this marvel of engineering for themselves. If you are ever in Todmorden, visit the Mason Arms Public House. Now they've got a small collection of images connected with this whole saga. And they've also got a really interesting quote from George Stephenson, the man who oversaw the construction of the tunnel itself way back in 1840. Now George Stephenson was quoted as saying, "I stake my reputation and my head that this tunnel will never fail so as to injure any human life." That was a pretty spectacular way to test your theory, but do you know what? Turned out he was right.